Okay, so for this deep dive, we're stepping into a place that's really deliberately hidden away, the correctional facility. We're sharing some, frankly, deeply unsettling true stories today. These come straight from correctional officers, from guards who work right in the thick of it. These are narratives about, well, about the kind of physical and psychological horror that's just part of their daily reality.
Right, and the sources we've looked at, they give us this crucial context, even if it's terrifying. They really pull back the curtain on these environments the public rarely sees, places where human behavior gets pushed to absolute extremes. And it's important to remember as we get into these stories, that line between keeping order and just total chaos. These officers walk that line every single day.
Yeah, exactly. So our focus here is going to be serious. It's going to be tense and honestly, pretty unnerving. We want to uncover the visceral truth of what it actually takes to survive, both mentally and physically, inside those walls. Let's start with the calculated danger guards face. This first one involves this strange intersection of respect and betrayal. So we have this account from someone whose uncle was a prison guard for about 10 years. And he was known, apparently, the quote was, a human among imprisoned humans. He'd built this reputation just by doing small things, a few extra minutes on a phone call, just basic kindness in a really cold place. And the inmates, they genuinely respected him for it.
And that's such a paradox in prison, isn't it? Having that reputation for decency, it can buy you a certain level of, let's say, casual safety. You're less likely to be targeted randomly. But on the other hand, it means they see you as a person, someone with a family, with connections. And that can actually make you a valuable commodity, I guess, when things get desperate.
That's precisely the terror here. So 5 inmates, they meticulously planned this breakout, and it required taking a hostage. But because they respected this specific guard, the uncle, they deliberately chose a day he wasn't scheduled to work. They didn't want him involved or hurt. But then that night, he ends up substituting for a colleague, steps right into the middle of their plan, completely unaware. So when they make their move, they put this makeshift gun to his head, and the leader, the main hostage taker, he just stalks. He's genuinely stunned, looks the guard right in the eye, and asks this chilling question. You aren't supposed to be here. Why the fuck are you here?
Wow. Even in that moment.
Yeah. But the plan was already in motion, too far gone. It just descended into chaos. Responding officers shot 2 of the escapees in the knee, including that hostage taker. The whole thing fell apart. The uncle, he survived physically, but the psychological impact. It took weeks off work, a lot of trauma recovery. And the chilling part is, it wasn't about hating him. It was just proximity. Bad timing when the stakes were literally life and death.
And that threat, it doesn't just stop at the prison gate, does it? We also looked at the story of a retired officer, worked for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, so federal institutions. This guy, he was attacked inside the prison with a pipe. Nearly died. They never figured out exactly why or who specifically ordered it, but the threat became very clear later. He found out he was on the Mexican Mafia's kill list.
And just to give some context there, the Mexican Mafia, LAME, it's one of the most powerful, most ruthless prison gangs in the U.S. Being on their list is essentially a death sentence, inside or out. This officer, the source's father, started getting these threatening phone calls, really specific ones, mentioning his kids, watching them at the bus stop.
And this wasn't just any officer. He was highly trained, part of the Special Operations Response Team sort. They handle riots, major incidents. He'd seen it all. But the source says even now he refuses to write down or document his experiences. He doesn't want to get anyone in trouble, maybe stir things up again. That silence, it speaks volumes about the danger that lingers, the fear that you could expose yourself or your family to retaliation even years after you've left the job.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. From those sort of calculated physical threats, let's move into the deep psychological terror. When the inmate's mind itself becomes the source of the horror, we have an account from a guard whose father worked death row, state pen. And apparently his dad was rarely fazed by anything he saw there, until he encountered Nico Jenkins.
Jenkins. Yeah, the media dubbed him the Serpent God Killer. His crimes were just utterly random and incredibly brutal. Killed 4 people in Omaha, Nebraska with a shotgun. No connection, no clear motive beyond what he claimed, that he was acting on orders from this ancient Egyptian serpent god Apophis.
But for the officers dealing with him, the horror wasn't just the crime itself. It was his behavior in custody. It was like a performance. He'd speak in tongues during court hearings, howl like an animal, laugh hysterically while the prosecutors were reading out the details of how the victims died. This guard's father, he was assigned to observe Jenkins. 8 straight hours in close proximity. He admitted later it was the single most disturbing experience he had ever had. It just leaves you wondering, right, is it genuine psychosis? Or is the performance itself a weapon designed to shatter the sanity of everyone around him?
That's always the terrifying question, isn't it? Performance or reality?
Well.
But sometimes the reality is just undeniably grotesquely real, and maybe even worse than some claimed serpent god, like the inmate with Pica. You know, the disorder where people compulsively eat non-food items. This guy, he needed surgery weekly because he kept swallowing dangerous objects, batteries, screws, pieces of metal.
Great, weekly abdominal surgery? That alone is horrifying.
It is. But here's where it goes off the rails into just pure visceral horror. Because they had to cut him open so often, the surgeons actually installed a temporary zipper in his abdomen, like a literal zipper. So one night, an officer doing rounds finds this guy. He'd somehow slipped his restraints, unzipped himself, and was just sitting calmly on his bunk, playing with his own small intestines.
Oh, God.
Yeah, just holding them. The officer said the casualness of it, combined with the physical reality, it just broke something in his understanding of what's possible.
That image is. Wow. It's a really potent, almost nauseating lead-in to our next story. This one is one of the most bizarre incidents reported. It involves this rapid, terrifying decline that seemed to completely defy conventional medicine, the story of the bank executive known as Johnny. So, Johnny arrives at the jail. He's ranting, raving, completely agitated, claiming he's been cursed by a voodoo practitioner. But everything else about him screamed normal, successful life. Nice suit, current ID, a gold Amex card, cash in his wallet. They put him in isolation, tried antipsychotics, constant medical checks, but nothing worked. He just got worse fast. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, just screamed constantly for someone to call this voodoo man down in Miami and pay him off.
And the physical deterioration was shocking. Barely, he was a big guy, like 6'2", 220 pounds, healthy. Then 2 weeks, he dropped 60 pounds. His skin turned gray, just hanging off his bones. Whatever was happening, standard institutional medicine had absolutely no answer for it.
And then there was the smell. The guard who shared this story described this distinct, pervasive odor that filled the entire floor where Johnny was held. He described it as a not quite decay, not quite gangrene, not quite vomit or feces, but all of that rolled into a roiling funk with a strange edge of spiciness, kind of like hot sauce, just this uniquely horrific smell.
What's so unsettling there is that the physical decay, it wasn't from a recognizable illness or injury they could find. It seemed to be happening because his mind, his belief system was shutting his body down. He was literally wasting away because he believed he was under a curse with a deadline.
And in the few moments he was lucid, Johnny would just plead with the guards, beg them to use his Amex card to pay the man in Miami. He was desperate. Then, about a week into this rapid decline, something changed. His mother called the watch commander. She had this thick Haitian accent, apparently, and she was really excited, almost relieved. She explained she'd finally managed to pay the voodoo man in Miami, and she said, Johnny will be okay now. The backstory came out then. Johnny had been on vacation in Miami, attended some kind of voodoo ceremony, got spooked, maybe disrespected someone or something, and he was cursed. The curse was specific. He'd become a zombie, essentially waste away and die, if this voodoo practitioner wasn't paid by a certain deadline.
So the system, Western medicine, it failed him completely. But his own cultural context, that intervention, it seemingly worked.
It's incredible. The officer went up to Johnny's cell right after the call to tell him his family was arranging to get him. And the smell, completely gone. Johnny's skin color was back to normal. He was lucid, sitting up in his bunk, actually eating his lunch. And he looked at the guard, delighted, and said he knew the man had been paid. He could feel it. The transformation was apparently instantaneous. As they were leading Johnny out later, his mother, who looked thin and still shaking herself, thanked the guard. And then she added this final chilling warning. She said, "You have to pay the voodoo man. He should have known that." The officer reporting this said that whole event, the smell, the decline, the instant recovery, it remains the single most inexplicable and terrifying thing he witnessed in his entire career. Okay, let's transition again. Now focusing on just the sheer raw brutality that guards witness, senseless acts of violence that really define the darkest aspects of the system.
Yeah, the level of cruelty can be hard to comprehend. It often seems to defy any rational motive beyond asserting dominance or maybe just expressing pure rage. We have this account of an inmate, a lifer, who killed his cellmate. And then methodically he used the victim's blood to cover everything. The floor, the walls, the ceiling. Painted the entire cell red.
And why? Why would someone do that? He apparently thought this incredibly horrific act would guarantee him a spot in solitary confinement. He wanted out of general population that badly, but it didn't work. Prison admin didn't give him SHU. And the guard, recounting this, had the job of escorting the new cellmate into that same cell while the heavy smell of dried blood was still thick in the air. That level of dehumanization where a cellmate is just replaced, like furniture, in a space still marked by murder, it's profound. And this kind of senseless violence, it happens even among younger populations. We've got two really horrifying stories from a high-security juvenile facility. First, a fight started over a book. A single new book, which I guess was a valuable commodity there. One kid just grabbed the other kid and repeatedly smashed his head against the concrete floor. It just exploded in violence over a book.
It highlights how scarcity drives conflict, but also how control, even over something small like a book, becomes paramount in those environments. The cruelty becomes very specific, very focused.
The second story from Juvie is just freakishly awful. It involved one of the sliding cell doors operated remotely from a control room. A student apparently peeked his head out of the doorway just as the guard in the control room was closing it. The control room couldn't see him down low. The heavy sealed door just crushed his head. The source just added, "Fucked up man." And what else can you say?
That focus on specific, almost inventive cruelty shows up in adult facilities too. Take the murder methods reported. In one prison's art room, of all places, 2 inmates held a bench press bar across the third guy's chest, pinning him down, while a third inmate dropped a heavy dumbbell right onto the victim's forehead. The impact, the report says, dented his skull 1.5 inches deep. He was just motionless. Nothing left but twitching.
God. And then there are the ones that defy belief because the victim survives. This one, 2 prisoners were trying to kill another inmate. They had a shank, a makeshift knife, but it broke during the attack, so they improvised. They took a pen, jammed it into the victim's ear canal, and then stomped on the pen until it reportedly came out of his mouth.
Unbelievable.
And somehow, incredibly, he survived that.
You know, we have to talk about the cost of just witnessing this stuff day in, day out. It's not just the violence. Sometimes it's the medical realities that can just break an officer. We heard this account from a guard, escorting a new prisoner intake to the medical unit. The prisoner's legs were stiff, both completely wrapped in bandages. When the nurse started removing the bandages, what was underneath was just rotten, abscessed, gangrenous flesh, the result of long-term extreme heroin injection, probably with dirty needles.
Oh, man. The smell alone must have been.
Exactly. The sight, yes, but the stench of that neglected, decaying human tissue. It was apparently overwhelming. The infection was literally oozing onto the floor. And this officer, the source emphasized, this was a guy who'd seen stabbings, shootings, suicides, horrific accidents, seen it all. But this sight, this smell, he turned sheet white despite having dark skin. The doctor actually had to order him out of the room, called for backup, because he thought the officer was going to pass out. And the officer later said, of all the horrific things he'd witnessed, people shot, stabbed, hanging, a guy blowing his own head off, the sight and smell of that rotting flesh was, quote, by far the worst thing I have ever seen.
Why do you think that hit him harder than, say, immediate violent death?
It's speculation, but maybe because violence, however brutal, is often immediate. An act, you can almost rationalize it as a choice someone made, but seeing slow, neglected decay like that, it speaks to a different kind of horror. It represents this absolute failure, this helplessness, this prolonged suffering and neglect within the system. It's maybe a deeper, more existential horror about the human condition in captivity. That's the psychological burden.
That really leads into our final account, which points directly at systemic failure, where bureaucratic indifference or maybe just overload essentially becomes a form of active torture. This story comes from a juror who served on a case involving a county jail incident. The victim was someone serving a short sentence for a nonviolent DUI, just a regular guy, basically. But he was put into a 4-man cell that already had 7 other guys crammed into it. And 3 of those cellmates were known, documented violent offenders. One was a convicted rapist.
That's just a catastrophic failure of classification right there.
Yeah.
Basic safety protocols ignored. You simply do not house a nonviolent, low-risk individual with maximum security predators like that.
Well, predictably, the violent trio took over the cell. They started forcing the other 4 inmates, including the DUI guy, to fight each other. The source described it as sort of like Fight Club. If they refused, the 3 would beat them all severely.
Creating their own brutal hierarchy within the overcrowded space.
Exactly. Then one day, the trio just decided to target the DUI guy directly. They just started stomping him. And the most shocking part for this juror, the entire attack, all 15 minutes of it, was caught on the cell block security camera. They watched the footage in court, saw the victim getting stomped, his head repeatedly slammed against the cinder block wall. One attacker waited until he was unconscious, then came back and beat him some more. And the juror's agonizing realization was just incredibly simple. Why was nobody watching these cameras? for 15 whole minutes of this brutal beating.
And why was he in that cell in the first place?
Yeah.
That's the ultimate horror we pull from these accounts, isn't it? It's not just the individual acts of savagery, horrific as they are. It's the systemic indifference.
Yeah.
The decision or the oversight that put him there. And then the failure to monitor, the failure to intervene, the sister itself, through omission, through negligence, it enabled that violence. It turned administrative failures into, effectively, mechanisms of torture and potential death.
Yeah. So what we've really looked at today are these recurring themes, right? The profound psychological darkness inmates and guards navigate, the sheer, sometimes senseless brutality, and those moments where the job just pushes officers past any recognizable human breaking point. Their reality is just one of constant, pervasive, haunting danger.
And understanding these realities, even though they're incredibly dark and difficult to confront, it feels crucial. It's a reminder that there's this vast, unseen world operating just beneath the surface of what we consider normal society, a world defined by an extreme emotional and, frankly, mental cost for everyone involved.
Well, thank you for joining us on this pretty intense deep dive into these true horrifying accounts from behind prison walls. If you found these stories captivating or important, we'd really appreciate it if you would like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Horror Docs.
And maybe consider this. What does it truly mean when silence becomes the only perceived form of protection?
Until next time, try to be aware of the shadows. They're closer than you think.